In the mouth, in that region right behind it and underneath the tongue, we have these salivary glands, which serve to produce saliva. And the saliva has a couple different roles. Most important ingredient in saliva regarding digestion is salivary amylase, which initiates the breakdown of carbohydrates. This salivary mucus also helps lubricate food, facilitating movement in the mouth, bolus formation, and also swallowing. Saliva also contains immunoglobulin A, which prevents microbes from penetrating the epithelia, and the lysozyme, which makes saliva antimicrobial. So here's a fun fact: saliva also contains epidermal growth factor, which might have given rise to the adage, "A mother's kiss can heal a wound." Right? This growth factor could enter the wound and potentially initiate growth in that wound so they can heal. The control of salivation is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So this is the secretion of saliva. In the absence of food, parasympathetic stimulation helps keep saliva flowing at just the right level for comfort as you speak, swallow, sleep, and generally go about life. Oversalivation can occur, for example, if you're stimulated by the smell of food, but that food is not necessarily available for you to eat. Drooling is an extreme instance of the overproduction of saliva. During times of stress, such as before public speaking, sympathetic stimulation can take over, reducing salivation and producing the symptom of dry mouth, often associated with anxiety. When you're dehydrated, salivation is reduced, causing the mouth to feel dry, prompting you to take action to quench the thirst. Salivation can be stimulated by sight, smell, taste of food, and it can even be stimulated by just thinking of food. So me sitting here talking about pizza, if you like pizza, might even make you start salivating. So if you're reading about food and salivation right now, you could start producing saliva. How does the salivation process work while you're eating? Well, food contains chemicals that stimulate taste receptors on your tongue, which send impulses to the brainstem, and these areas in the brainstem then send back parasympathetic impulses through fibers in the nerves, stimulating salivation. Even after you swallow food, salivation is increased to cleanse the mouth and to water down and neutralize any irritating chemical remnants, such as hot sauce in your burrito. Most saliva is swallowed along with food and is reabsorbed so that the fluid, the water basically, that you produce to use saliva is not lost. So the pharynx comes right after the mouth, and it's involved in both digestion and respiration, as we saw last week. It receives food and air from the mouth and air from the nasal cavities. When food enters the pharynx, involuntary muscle contractions close off the air passageways. The pharynx runs from the posterior oral and nasal cavities to the opening of the esophagus and larynx, with those three divisions that we talked about last week in the naso, oral, and laryngopharynx. During swallowing, the elevator skeletal muscles of the pharynx contract, raising and expanding the pharynx to receive the bolus of food. Once received, these muscles relax and the constrictor muscles of the pharynx contract, forcing the bolus into the esophagus and initiating peristalsis. Usually during swallowing, the soft palate and uvula rise reflexively to close off the entrance to the nasopharynx, and at the same time, the larynx is pulled superiorly and the cartilaginous epiglottis, its most superior structure, folds inferiorly, covering the glottis, which is the opening to the larynx, so that we effectively block food from going into the trachea and bronchi. And this is the expression when the food goes down the wrong tube. It's because it's going into the trachea. We don't want that. When it does enter the trachea, the reaction is to cough rather aggressively, and it usually forces the food up back into the pharynx so it can be swallowed appropriately. The esophagus is right after the pharynx, and it's a muscular tube that connects to the stomach from the pharynx. Rhythmic waves of peristalsis are key here. So if you think of esophagus and how it contributes to digestion, think of propulsion or peristalsis. And this begins in the upper esophagus, propelling the bolus of food toward the stomach. And meanwhile, secretions from the esophageal mucosa lubricate that esophagus and also the food. Food passes from the esophagus into the stomach at the lower esophageal sphincter. This is also called the cardiac sphincter. We'll cover that in lab a little bit more. So the actual act of swallowing has a name called deglutition, and it's characterized by 3 different phases, if you will. This voluntary, pharyngeal, esophageal phase. The entire process takes about 4 to 8 seconds for solid or semi-solid food and 1 second for super soft or just liquid food. And although it sounds quick and effortless, it is actually a pretty complex process involving skeletal muscle, so voluntary control, and also muscles of the pharynx and esophagus that are more smooth muscle based. The voluntary phase is also known as the oral or buccal phase. Think of this as the actual act of moving food by the tongue from the oral cavity to your pharynx. Chewing has been completed at this point, and then swallowing is setting in motion. And at this point, the 2 involuntary phases of swallowing then begin. So voluntary is characterized in the oral cavity. In this pharyngeal phase, stimulation of the receptors in the oropharynx send impulses to the deglutition center, which is an area in the medulla. Impulses are then sent back to the uvula in the soft palate, causing them to move up and close off the nasopharynx so that we don't move food up into our nasal cavity. That would not be good, and that actually can happen sometimes when you drink something too fast and then you cough and then it goes up your nose and it doesn't feel very good. So we want to be able to close that off, so the medulla helps do that. And the laryngeal muscles also constrict to prevent aspiration of food into the trachea. And at this place, or point, deglutition apnea takes place, which means that breathing ceases for a brief time. That's good, so that we don't accidentally inhale food. Contractions of the pharyngeal constrictor muscles then move the bolus through the oro and laryngeal pharynx, and relaxation of the upper esophageal sphincter then allows food to enter the esophagus. Then entry of the food into this esophagus then starts the esophageal phase, which just makes sense, right? And this also starts the initiation of peristalsis. So, as in the previous phase, the complex neuromuscular actions are controlled by the medulla. Peristalsis propels the bolus through the esophagus toward the stomach. And then the circular muscle layer of the muscularis contracts, pinching the esophageal wall and forcing the bolus down or forward. At the same time, the longitudinal muscle layer of the muscularis contracts, shortening this area and pushing out its walls to receive the bolus. In this way, a series of contractions keep moving the food down to the stomach. So these 2 layers of the muscularis, right? When we talked about the histology of the alimentary canal, there were 2 muscle layers. They're both contracting in different places, so we can pinch off one area and then relax the next area, and then pinch off the next area and then relax the next area. So we're just moving the food down. And during this esophageal phase, esophageal glands secrete mucus to help lubricate that bolus and minimize friction. And when it nears the stomach, stretching of the esophagus down there initiates a reflex relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter, also known as the cardiac sphincter, allowing the bolus to pass into the stomach. So that's exactly what we're kind of looking at here. We can see this superior pharyngeal muscle, constrictor muscle, close off the nasopharynx, and then the medial pharyngeal constrictor muscle as well. Then we have this inferior and medial pharyngeal constrictor muscles, making sure that the food goes down, and then peristalsis occurring. And so on your own time, again, I will not play this video because it sounds horrible in my recordings, so I'll let you play that video. It has a nice animation for the act of swallowing to help in your studying.